on shared values of inclusivity, transparency, mutual respect, and mutual trust. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, now it's time to invite your comment, question, and thoughts to share any ideas of this discussion. So I'll open the floor. Maybe three first in the first session. Would you please mention your name and your institution, and to whom your question to direct? Please, the question and answer session is open. Yes, the gentleman behind. Bisa tolong mic-nya?
Thank you so much indeed for this opportunity. Appreciated to those keynote speaker and also presentation. Of course, it will enlighten our perspective and also amplify our ideas. Thank you so much indeed. I am Major General Budi Pramono. First of all, I would like to raise my question to Professor Amparu. Maraming salamat po. Maraming salamat for quoting my president. Pasensya na po kayo kung ako nga'y nakamali. Ipinakmakmalaki kung kayong lahat, Professor. Professor, I think from your idea dealing with your leisure, you really actively contribute to the 7 ASEAN outlooks. Appreciate it. However, on the other hand, you mentioned, given to the conflict or current event in Palawan Island, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned that there are much more Chinese militia. In this case, so this conflict trigger your idea to empower your army, strengthen your air force, and also enlighten your navy. My question is, Professor, I think this one very contradictory. In one hand, you mentioned about leisure, but on the other hand, you also raise the armed proliferation. You also build the arm race over there. So it will contradict much to the 7 ASEAN outlook. Would you mind to scrutinize a little bit for that? And the second one to the Professor Sabah dari Malaysia, from Malaysia.
Dr. Sabirin.
Dr. Sabirin, you mentioned about Sulu Island, the importance of the Sulu Islands, Sulawesi Island, and you mentioned also it will, what you call it, joint patrol or whatever the terminology among Malaysia, Brunei, in Indonesia. I think you are very optimist people, optimist person. From my perception, I really little bit pessimist to see and to absorb and also analyze for that combined or joint activity to anticipate Sulu Island and Sulawesi Island. Because come to the interest, come to the national interest, even vital interest, important interest, marginal interest, survival interest, I do believe that those countries will have different interests. So my question is, how can you anticipate those vulnerability if we really make it what's called combined activity or joint patrol or whatever the terminology is, to anticipate the problem in the future for the Sulu and Sulawesi Island. And the last one, to the keynote speech from Singapore. Madam, many people said about what is actually the usefulness of laws what is actually the certainty that we got from enforce the laws, and also what is actually the justice that we get it when we are talking about laws. And your presentation said about UNCLOS. For your own perception, Singaporean perception, what is actually the justice that you got it? What is actually the usefulness that you got it? What is actually the certainty that you got it from UNCLOS? Moderator, thank you so much indeed for this opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for that question. I would like to address the first question with respect to the seeming contradictory nature of the modernization of the armed forces and the peaceful conduct in the South China Sea. In my lecture, I focused more on the Philippine Coast Guard and the role, the maritime law enforcement capabilities of the Philippine Coast Guard. So specifically in the South China Sea, for this particular crisis situation of the Chinese maritime militia, the Philippines applied soft diplomacy in the form of filing more than 362 diplomatic protests. So the Philippines applies the peaceful way of settling disputes. And with respect to the modernization of the Philippine Coast Guard, the aim is primarily to strengthen its maritime law enforcement operations, particularly in focusing on irregular, unregulated, and unreported fishing, and also in the area of maritime pollution, because that falls under the mandate of the Philippine Coast Guard, as well as the promotion of freedom of navigation to promote trade and commerce in our territorial waters, and lastly, the one of promoting humanitarian action and disaster response. So all this capability building is focused on enhancing search and rescue, addressing marine pollution, addressing IUU fishing, as well as humanitarian and disaster response. So we are not really focused more on the military solution to the conflict, but we are looking at the most peaceful way to address the rising tensions in the South China Sea. Thank you.
Please, Dato, for the second question.
Thank you, Attorney. Thank you, General, for your question and your concern as well. I'm an optimist person. I appreciate your experience on the ground, seeing that there are a lot of conflicts happening.
Bapak yang di sini tadi ya? Oke Pak, silakan Pak.
Thank you so much indeed for this opportunity. I really like to ask question first from Singaporean. You mentioned about AUKUS update 2023, and I really pay attention with your very interesting sentence. What is that? Nuance changed in tone. That's very good sentences. And in this case also you mentioned that Singaporeans fully supported US military presence, if I'm not mistaken, in your slide. So my question is, I think you do realize that your neighbor, Indonesia and Malaysia, besides, you also supported the U.S. military presence. So, what do you think if I heard and I observed the slide before dealing with the nuclear weapon? U.S. is the one who has the type UV. I mean FU. Sorry, FU. So Not like China. China is NFU. So what do you think? Because we are talking about preemptive strike. Because yesterday we are talking about how to solidify ASEAN, how to unite ASEAN. So I really want to know from your perspective, from Singaporean eyes. That's the first one. And to Singapore, and then to Malaysian, Dr. Ping Ho. Oh, sorry, yeah, Dr. Ping Ho. You're talking about the nuclear plant. Will you, Malaysian, will build the nuclear power plant? I think you said, and you will answer no. But before 2010, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, that you also have the plan to build nuclear power plant. Given to the unrenewable resources, unrenewable natural resources, so I think it is the indispensable factor to build nuclear power plant. But you really, what you call it, promote and campaign that not need to build nuclear power plant. So I really want to know the certainty answer, the certain answer. And then we can have, what you call it, we step on the other step as the solid ASEAN or unite ASEAN. And then from Philippines, magandang hapon po. Pasensya na po kung ako ay nakamali, pinakmak malaki kung kayong lahat. And you said about concept bandwagon hegemon. I like it. That's very good terminology. Very interesting terminology. Bandwagon with hegemon. What do you think if the concept bandwagon hegemon from day-to-day activity develop much? Develop much. Directly or indirectly, intentional or unintentionally, that the concept bandwagon with hegemon actually raise up much. Maybe we really not scrutinize in detail, country to country. As I mentioned from the beginning, from yesterday, we have different vital interests, we have different important interests, we have different marginal interests, we have different survival interests. What is the formula to solidify, to unite ASEAN? If the concept bandwagon with hegemon come up and raise very significant. And the last one about nuclear arms race. I like very much that NFU, face-to-face FU. I think this one reflects was the art of war by Sun Tzu, face-to-face on war by Clausewitz. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm not mistaken. So, in this case also you mentioned about minilateral come up, sporadic. Looks like the grass that come up sporadic in the session of a rainy session. So what do you think in this case about the AUKUS? If that's happened, simultaneously we always solidify, unite ASEAN, but simultaneously in the same time, because of, as I mentioned, always vital interest, important interest, marginal interest, survival interest, different country has different perception. So in conclusion, even you mentioned that tend to solve the problem, each countries, not as a group of ASEAN, but each country will have their own each solution. What do you think about that? Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you, Pak. Okay, we have several, two persons who are asking a question, but then consists of several questions.
Philippines, Australia, we support a U.S. military presence in the region where there's no apologies about it. I think we can agree that the U.S. security guarantees, hub and spokes model has provided the peace and prosperity and stability that we've seen since 1945. That's beyond dispute. I think the question of FU, the first use policy, I think in Southeast Asia, I mean with SEANWFZ and all, there's a natural allergy to anything that has the label nuclear on it. I'll say that we shouldn't have that kind of visceral allergic reaction to the term nuclear. And of course, I need to emphasize that AUKUS in itself is not about nuclear weapons, it's about nuclear propulsion, which is an entirely different bag of fish together. And I would say that if this weekend you do have some time, you should watch this classic movie. There was 1962, Peter Sellers in Why I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. I mean, this is a movie that I watched when I was doing postgrad studies at the Australian National University, and a lot of questions about nuclear escalation, deterrence, ladders of escalation. You can learn a lot even from this movie. In fact, I'll say if you want to go to a place to learn about nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons, this is the movie to watch. And I'm going a long way to come around to this, but first use policy, unlikely that the United States will do it on a non-nuclear weapon state, more likely on a nuclear weapon state. And if that's the case, there's a very low probability, if not remote, if not zero, that it wouldn't be used in a Southeast Asian contingency. If we do see the first use policy being affected by the US, it's more likely in Northeast Asia, whether it's
Some want to have more closer relations with China, but that is because of their respective national interests, their respective national and political security interests. But when it comes to national economic interests, this is where I see it converging with with ASEAN's regional interest. I think if you will ask all ASEAN member states, everybody wants to be prosperous. Everybody wants to be rich. And so I think this is that avenue to make ASEAN really an economic power, which is why I said, sir, in my presentation, ASEAN is actually a geopolitical player, because dialogue partners would not engage with ASEAN if they don't see the potential of ASEAN. And so I think, sir, the case should be the dialogue partners should be dependent on ASEAN and not ASEAN dependent on the major powers. Because if ASEAN is dependent on the major powers, then it is more susceptible to interference, to possible inducements or sanctions, things like that. And so I think ASEAN should go with this way of, economic community. It is through economics that ASEAN can preserve its geopolitical and political centrality. And as to the balance of power, sir, yes, as a matter of principle, any country would not just renounce their claims. So everybody wants to modernize and build up their armed forces to achieve balance of power. They also would want to align with external power so that there will be a balance of power. But this balance of power, sir, can also lead to miscalculation, which is why I said so in my presentation, it could lead to war and conflict. And sometimes balance of power preserves the peace, but sometimes the balance of power actually leads to conflict. But let's hope it doesn't lead to conflict. So it is really dependent on the agency of the leaders in many countries as to how to work or iron things out.
Start nuclear energy program. I think this is a very good opportunity for all countries to really start exercising familiarization among ourselves. What do we actually think about nuclear energy right now? Because SEANWFZ doesn't prohibit us to explore the options. So if we want to, we can. But how can we assure one another? So General also asked a question. So Malaysia wanted to have nuclear plant before. Yes, we do. So it is a plan, more than 30 years in making. When Tun Mahathir became Prime Minister in 1981, by 1983, he sent the first batch of Malaysians studying in nuclear engineering overseas. And these people, when they return to Malaysia, they become the key person who were involved in the drafting of ZOPFAN, Zone of Peace and Neutrality. So when SEANWFZ was drafted, it was also one of the first 2 articles recognizing it is a key component of ZOPFAN. So as long as we pledge to the peaceful use of nuclear energy, that is allowed. But